190 years after the fact, in a dusty courthouse basement in Montgomery County, Alabama, historian Dr. Sarah Collins made a discovery that would shatter everything she thought she knew about antebellum plantation records. Hidden behind a false wall, deteriorating court documents from 1835 told of mass deaths at the Whitmore Plantation, deaths that had been systematically erased from every official record, every church registry, and every family genealogy she had ever encountered. The papers, water-damaged and barely legible, spoke of sudden mortality affecting both family and field hands, and circumstances requiring immediate intervention by county authorities. What struck Dr. Collins as most disturbing wasn't just the scope of the deaths described, but the obvious effort to conceal them. Names had been blacked out with thick ink, dates had been altered, and entire paragraphs had been cut from the documents with surgical precision. The Whitmore Plantation had been one of Alabama's largest cotton operations in the 1830s, employing over 300 enslaved people across thousands of acres of prime agricultural land. Historical records showed it as a model plantation, profitable, well-managed, and apparently free of the violent uprisings that plagued other operations throughout the Deep South. The family patriarch, Colonel James Whitmore, was frequently cited in contemporary newspapers as an exemplary planter who maintained proper discipline while avoiding the excesses that led to rebellion elsewhere. But these courthouse documents told a different story entirely. They spoke of a plantation in chaos, of deaths that came in waves, and of a community paralyzed by fear. Most intriguingly, they referenced a single enslaved person, identified only as Ezra, who had vanished during the crisis and was believed to be responsible for what the documents cryptically called the contamination. Dr. Collins spent weeks poring over these fragments, cross-referencing them with shipping records, medical journals, and private correspondence from other plantations in the region. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge. Other plantations had reported similar mysterious illnesses during the same time period, but only among enslaved populations. White families remained largely unaffected, leading plantation owners to initially dismiss the deaths as disease or poor living conditions. The breakthrough came when Dr. Collins discovered a private letter from Dr. Nathaniel Morse, a physician who had been called to attend several plantations during the summer of 1835. Writing to a colleague in Charleston, Dr. Morse described symptoms that were unlike any natural pestilence he had encountered. The affected showed signs of severe gastric distress, convulsions, and rapid deterioration that suggested deliberate contamination of food or water sources. Most chilling was Dr. Morse's observation that the pattern of death seemed calculated and precise, affecting certain individuals while sparing others in a way that suggested intimate knowledge of plantation routines and hierarchies. He noted that overseers and trusted house slaves were often the first to succumb, followed by field hands who worked specific sections of the plantation. The plantation families themselves remained largely unaffected until the final weeks, when the contamination appeared to spread to their food supplies as well. The letter concluded with a warning that Dr. Morse never sent. "I fear we are dealing not with disease but with a mind of extraordinary cunning and patience. Someone with detailed knowledge of our operations has turned our own systems against us. If my suspicions prove correct, we face not a medical crisis but an act of war conducted with weapons we never thought to guard against." The letter was dated August 15, 1835, just 3 days before all records of the Whitmore Plantation abruptly ceased. After nearly 2 decades of meticulous record-keeping, documenting everything from cotton yields to slave births, the plantation's ledgers simply stopped. No sale records, no transfer of property, no death certificates or estate proceedings. It was as if the entire operation had simply vanished from official memory. Dr. Collins realized she was looking at evidence of a cover-up so complete and systematic that it had nearly succeeded in erasing one of the most significant acts of slave resistance in American history. But who was Ezra? How had a single enslaved person managed to orchestrate such devastation? And why had the truth been buried so thoroughly that even local historians had no knowledge of what had occurred? As she prepared to dig deeper into the mystery, Dr. Collins couldn't shake the feeling that she was uncovering something that powerful people had wanted to remain buried forever. The very completeness of the silence suggested that what happened at Whitmore Plantation had implications far beyond a single act of revenge, implications that threatened the carefully constructed narrative of plantation life that had dominated Southern history for generations. To understand the magnitude of what Ezra accomplished, one must first comprehend the empire he destroyed. The Whitmore plantation was not simply a farming operation. It was a carefully orchestrated machine of human exploitation that had perfected the art of extracting maximum labor while maintaining absolute control over every aspect of enslaved lives. Colonel James Whitmore had inherited the land from his father in 1820, but it was his cruel innovation and business acumen that transformed it into one of Alabama's most profitable operations. Unlike many planters who relied primarily on physical intimidation, Whitmore had developed what he called scientific management, a system that combined psychological manipulation with strategic rewards and punishments to create what appeared to be a model plantation. The key to Whitmore's system was information. Every enslaved person on the plantation was monitored constantly by a network of overseers, trusted house slaves, and informants who reported directly to the colonel. He maintained detailed files on each individual, noting their relationships, their skills, their fears, and most importantly, their potential for resistance. This intelligence network allowed him to identify and eliminate threats before they could develop into organized rebellion. Whitmore's house slaves were particularly crucial to this system. Unlike many plantations where house slaves enjoyed relative privilege, Whitmore deliberately rotated individuals between field and housework, preventing the formation of stable relationships or power structures. Those who served in the house were required to report on conversations, mood changes, and any signs of discontent among their fellow enslaved people. In return, they received better food, clothing, and the promise that their children might eventually join the house staff. The plantation's physical layout reflected this obsession with control. The slave quarters were arranged in a horseshoe pattern around a central courtyard, allowing overseers to monitor all activities from a single watchtower. The quarters themselves were deliberately overcrowded, forcing people to sleep in shifts and preventing private conversations. Even the timing of meals was staggered to prevent large gatherings that might facilitate planning or organization. But it was Whitmore's psychological methods that truly set his operation apart. He had studied accounts of slave rebellions throughout the Caribbean and had identified what he believed were the key factors that led to successful uprisings: strong leadership, shared grievances, and access to weapons or tools that could be used as weapons. His system was designed to eliminate each of these elements systematically. Leadership was prevented through a policy of deliberate family separation. Any enslaved person who showed signs of natural authority or who commanded respect from others was immediately sold to distant plantations, often with no warning to their families. This created a climate of constant fear and uncertainty, as people never knew when they might be torn away from their loved ones. It also ensured that no stable leadership structure could emerge among the enslaved population. Shared grievances were managed through Whitmore's system of arbitrary rewards and punishments. Rather than maintaining consistent rules, he deliberately varied his treatment of different individuals, creating resentment and competition rather than solidarity. One family might receive extra food rations while another was reduced to near starvation, with the criteria for such treatment kept deliberately mysterious. This prevented the formation of unified resistance, as people were never sure whether their suffering was shared or unique. Access to potential weapons was controlled through meticulous inventory systems. Every tool, every piece of equipment, every kitchen implement was counted daily and secured each night. Even seemingly harmless items like rope, nails, or glass fragments were carefully monitored. The plantation's blacksmith shop and carpentry workshop were operated exclusively by white craftsmen brought in from nearby towns, ensuring that enslaved people never gained access to metalworking or tool-making skills. Yet for all his precautions, Whitmore had one crucial blind spot. The very intelligence network he relied upon had created the perfect position for someone with the right knowledge and patience to strike back. By 1835, the plantation was home to an enslaved man known only as Ezra, whose true background remained mysterious even to Whitmore's extensive record-keeping system. Ezra had arrived at the plantation in 1832, purchased from a slave trader who claimed he had been acquired from an estate sale in South Carolina. But unlike most enslaved people, who came with detailed documentation of their skills, health, and work history, Ezra's past was remarkably vague. The trader claimed he was approximately 30 years old, had experience with both field and housework, and had no history of rebellion or escape attempts. What the trader failed to mention, and what Whitmore failed to discover, was that Ezra possessed knowledge that would ultimately prove more dangerous than any weapon. Ezra's first months at Whitmore Plantation revealed a man of extraordinary discipline and intelligence. Unlike many newly acquired enslaved people, who struggled with the transition to a new environment and different routines, Ezra seemed to adapt effortlessly. He learned the plantation's complex social hierarchy quickly, identified the key players in Whitmore's information network, and positioned himself as exactly the kind of reliable, unremarkable worker that the system was designed to reward. What made Ezra particularly dangerous was his apparent invisibility. In a system designed to monitor and control every aspect of enslaved life, he had mastered the art of being present without being noticed. He volunteered for the most mundane tasks: cleaning, basic maintenance, food preparation, jobs that required access to multiple areas of the plantation but were considered too menial to warrant close supervision. Within months, he had gained access to virtually every building, every storage area, and every operational system on the property. Contemporary accounts from other enslaved people, gathered decades later through oral history projects, described Ezra as quiet, helpful, and unremarkable. He seemed to have no close friends, no obvious family connections, and no apparent interest in the social dynamics that consumed most plantation communities. He attended religious services when required, performed his assigned work without complaint, and showed appropriate deference to white authorities and black overseers alike. But this apparent conformity masked an extraordinary process of intelligence gathering. While others saw Ezra performing routine tasks, he was systematically mapping every aspect of the plantation's operations. He learned the schedules of every overseer, the routines of every family member, the patterns of food delivery and water distribution. Most crucially, he began to understand the chemical and biological vulnerabilities that Whitmore's system had inadvertently created. The plantation's water system, which Whitmore considered one of his most advanced innovations, became Ezra's primary area of focus. Rather than relying on individual wells scattered throughout the property, Whitmore had constructed a centralized system that drew water from a deep artesian well and distributed it through a network of wooden pipes and storage tanks. This system provided cleaner, more reliable water than most plantations could offer, and Whitmore frequently used it as an example of his progressive management methods. What Whitmore didn't realize was that this centralized system created a single point of vulnerability that could affect the entire plantation. Ezra spent months studying the water distribution network, learning which pipes served which buildings, which storage tanks supplied different areas of the plantation, and most importantly, where interventions might be made without detection. His knowledge extended beyond just the physical infrastructure. Through his work in food preparation and storage, Ezra gained access to the plantation's entire food supply chain. He learned which foods were prepared where, how long different items were stored before consumption, and which meals were served to different groups of people. The plantation's hierarchical food system, which ensured that white families received the best cuts of meat and freshest vegetables, while enslaved people subsisted on minimal rations, created multiple opportunities for selective contamination. Perhaps most importantly, Ezra began to understand the social vulnerabilities within Whitmore's information network. He identified which house slaves were genuine informants and which were simply trying to survive in an impossible situation. He learned which overseers were truly loyal to Whitmore and which were motivated primarily by fear or financial necessity. This knowledge allowed him to begin planting seeds of misinformation and confusion that would prove crucial when his plan finally began to unfold. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. The most remarkable aspect of Ezra's preparation was its duration and patience. For nearly 3 years, he methodically gathered information, tested small interventions, and refined his understanding of the plantation's vulnerabilities. He experimented with different plants and substances that could be found naturally on the plantation grounds, learning their effects and proper dosages. He studied the seasonal patterns that affected food storage and water quality. He even learned to read by watching the plantation's children during their lessons, gaining access to medical and agricultural texts that provided crucial knowledge about poisons and their effects. By 1835, Ezra had transformed himself into something unprecedented in the history of American slavery, a single individual with the knowledge, access, and patience to strike at the very heart of the plantation system. But his plan went far beyond simple revenge. What he envisioned was a demonstration that would expose the fundamental vulnerabilities of the entire system of human bondage, proving that even the most carefully controlled plantation could be brought to its knees by someone with sufficient knowledge and determination. The irony was that Whitmore's own innovations had made Ezra's plan possible. The centralized water system, the hierarchical food distribution, the complex social networks, all of these improvements had created opportunities that a more primitive plantation would never have offered. In his effort to create the perfect system of control, Whitmore had inadvertently created the perfect target for someone with the intelligence and patience to exploit its weaknesses. As summer 1835 approached, Ezra was ready to begin the most audacious act of resistance in the history of American slavery. But his plan required perfect timing, absolute secrecy, and a willingness to accept consequences that would likely cost him his life. What drove him to take such risks remained a mystery that would haunt investigators for generations. The first deaths began in June 1835, starting with the plantation's most trusted overseers and house slaves, the very people whose loyalty Whitmore had spent years cultivating. Samuel Tucker, the head overseer who had served the plantation for nearly a decade, was found dead in his cabin on a Tuesday morning, his body contorted in what the plantation's medical records described as violent gastric distress. Within days, 3 more overseers had succumbed to similar symptoms, followed by Martha, the head cook, and 2 other house slaves who had access to the main house. At first, Whitmore attributed these deaths to summer fever or contaminated food supplies. Such mortality was not uncommon on southern plantations during the hottest months, when poor sanitation and spoiled food could create deadly outbreaks. He ordered increased vigilance over food preparation and had the plantation's water sources tested by Dr. Morse, the local physician who served several plantations in the region. But Dr. Morse's initial examination revealed something troubling. The symptoms displayed by the victims were inconsistent with typical summer illnesses. Rather than the prolonged fever and wasting associated with diseases like typhoid or cholera, these deaths were characterized by rapid onset, severe abdominal pain, and what Dr. Morse described as neurological disturbances suggesting deliberate poisoning rather than natural disease. More concerning still was the pattern of deaths. Rather than spreading randomly through the plantation population, as diseases typically did, the mortality was concentrated among specific individuals, those who held positions of authority or trust within the plantation hierarchy. Field hands working in close proximity to the deceased remained healthy, while other overseers and house slaves began showing symptoms despite having limited contact with the initial victims. Whitmore ordered a lockdown of the plantation, preventing anyone from leaving the property, and instituting strict controls over food and water distribution. Guards were posted at all storage facilities, and meals were prepared under close supervision. For a brief period, the deaths seemed to stop, leading Whitmore to believe that his precautions had identified and contained the source of contamination. But Ezra's plan was far more sophisticated than Whitmore realized. The initial deaths had not been random acts of revenge, but carefully calculated strikes designed to eliminate the plantation's intelligence network and create confusion about the source of the threat. With the most loyal and observant members of the plantation hierarchy removed, Ezra could operate with far greater freedom, while the remaining overseers struggled to maintain control over an increasingly fearful and suspicious enslaved population. The second wave of deaths began in July, targeting different victims through different methods. Rather than the rapid, violent symptoms that had characterized the earlier deaths, these victims experienced gradual deterioration over several weeks. They complained of fatigue, loss of appetite, and persistent stomach ailments that grew progressively worse until they were unable to work. Several died in their sleep after prolonged illness, while others succumbed to what appeared to be heart failure. Dr. Morse, now deeply suspicious that the plantation was dealing with deliberate poisoning rather than natural causes, began conducting more thorough examinations of the deceased. His private notes, discovered nearly 2 centuries later, revealed his growing alarm at the sophistication of what he was witnessing. The symptoms suggested the use of multiple different poisons, administered in carefully calculated doses over varying periods of time. Some victims showed signs of acute poisoning from substances like arsenic or mercury, while others appeared to have been slowly poisoned with plant-based toxins that accumulated in their systems over weeks or months. Most disturbing was Dr. Morse's realization that the poisoner possessed extensive knowledge of human anatomy and physiology. The doses were calibrated precisely to cause maximum suffering while avoiding patterns that might immediately reveal deliberate contamination. Different poisons were used for different victims, suggesting either access to a wide variety of toxic substances or the ability to extract and concentrate poisons from plants and minerals available on the plantation itself. By August, the death toll had reached 23 people, including most of Whitmore's senior staff and several members of extended family who had been visiting the plantation. The local authorities were finally notified and an investigation was launched by the county sheriff's department. But their inquiry was hampered by Whitmore's insistence on maintaining secrecy about the extent of the crisis, his fear that news of the deaths would damage his reputation and property values. The investigation focused initially on identifying possible sources of contamination in the plantation's food and water supplies. Wells were tested, storage facilities were examined, and interviews were conducted with surviving plantation personnel. But these efforts revealed no obvious sources of contamination, leading investigators to conclude that the poisoning must be the work of someone with intimate knowledge of the plantation's operations and access to its most secure facilities. Suspicion gradually focused on the enslaved population, but even here the investigation faced significant challenges. The deaths had eliminated most of Whitmore's informant network, making it difficult to gather intelligence about possible conspiracies or resistance activities. Many of the remaining enslaved people were too frightened to speak openly, while others may have been protecting the perpetrator out of loyalty or fear. It was during this period of investigation that Ezra's name first appeared in official records. Several witnesses identified him as someone who had been present in areas where contamination might have occurred, but none could provide direct evidence of wrongdoing. His quiet, helpful demeanor had made him nearly invisible throughout his time at the plantation, and investigators found it difficult to believe that such an unremarkable individual could be responsible for such sophisticated and sustained poisoning. The breakthrough came when investigators discovered that several of the early victims had consumed food or water that had been prepared or handled by Ezra in the days before their deaths. But rather than providing clear evidence of guilt, this discovery raised new questions about the scope of the conspiracy. How could a single individual have gained access to so many different food sources? How had he acquired the knowledge necessary to carry out such precise poisoning? And most puzzling of all, how had he managed to avoid suspicion for so long while operating under the intense scrutiny of Whitmore's surveillance system? These questions would never be answered, because by the time investigators began to focus seriously on Ezra as a suspect, he had vanished completely. His disappearance marked the beginning of the final and most deadly phase of his campaign against Whitmore Plantation. On the morning of August 20th, 1835, Ezra simply ceased to exist. His sleeping space in the overcrowded slave quarters was found empty, his few personal possessions still in place, but the man himself had vanished without leaving any trace of how or when he had departed. The plantation was still under lockdown, with guards posted at all exits and regular patrols monitoring the grounds. Yet somehow he had managed to slip away undetected. Whitmore's immediate response was to launch a massive manhunt, mobilizing every available resource to track down the escaped slave who had become his prime suspect. Dogs were brought in to follow scent trails, local militias were alerted, and rewards were posted throughout the region. Neighboring plantations were warned to be on the lookout for a dangerous fugitive who might attempt to find shelter or employment on their properties. But the search efforts revealed just how little anyone actually knew about Ezra. Despite 3 years on the plantation, he had managed to remain essentially anonymous. He had no known friends or allies among the enslaved population, no documented family connections, and no clear regional ties that might suggest where he would flee. Even his physical description was frustratingly vague. Witnesses could remember that he was of medium height and build, appeared to be in his 30s, and had distinctive scars on his hands. But beyond these basic details, accounts varied significantly. What the searchers didn't realize was that Ezra hadn't actually left the plantation at all. His disappearance was part of a carefully planned final phase of his campaign, designed to maximize both the psychological impact of his actions and his ability to continue operations without detection. For years, he had been preparing secret hiding places throughout the property, taking advantage of his maintenance work to create concealed spaces in outbuildings, storage facilities, and even within the main house itself. These hiding spots were supplied with food, water, and most importantly, the materials he needed to continue his poisoning campaign. But rather than the crude shelters that escaping slaves typically created, Ezra's refuges were sophisticated concealment systems that allowed him to monitor plantation activities while remaining completely hidden. He had studied the search patterns used by slave catchers and had designed his hideouts to be virtually undetectable even by experienced trackers. From these hidden positions, Ezra began the most devastating phase of his campaign. With the plantation in chaos and security focused on external threats, he had unprecedented access to the main house and its occupants. The Whitmore family, already frightened by the deaths of their overseers and servants, found themselves facing a new wave of illness that struck at the heart of their previously secure domestic environment. Mrs. Elizabeth Whitmore was the first family member to show serious symptoms, developing what initially appeared to be a mild stomach ailment that gradually worsened over several days. Her condition deteriorated rapidly, progressing from nausea and fatigue to violent convulsions and delirium. Dr. Morse, now in almost constant attendance at the plantation, recognized the symptoms immediately as consistent with the other poisoning cases, but was baffled by how the contamination had reached the main house despite increased security measures. The psychological impact on the plantation was catastrophic. The enslaved population, already terrorized by months of unexplained deaths and increasingly brutal security measures, began to panic as rumors spread that Ezra had returned as a vengeful spirit to continue his campaign of destruction. Some claimed to have seen him moving through the plantation at night, while others reported finding evidence of his presence: food that had been disturbed, tools that had been moved, or mysterious marks left in the dust of rarely used buildings. Colonel Whitmore himself began showing signs of severe mental strain. The man who had prided himself on maintaining absolute control over his domain found himself helpless against an enemy he could neither locate nor understand. His detailed records and careful surveillance systems had proven useless against someone who seemed to operate outside all normal patterns of behavior. The very innovations he had used to create the perfect plantation had become weapons in the hands of someone with the knowledge and patience to exploit their vulnerabilities. Security measures became increasingly desperate and counterproductive. Guards were stationed throughout the main house, but their presence only added to the atmosphere of fear and suspicion. Food was now prepared under armed watch and tested extensively before consumption, but these precautions slowed meal preparation and created new opportunities for contamination during the extended handling process. Water was boiled and filtered multiple times, but the complex distribution system made it impossible to secure every possible point of contamination. The plantation's operations began to collapse under the weight of these security measures. Field work slowed dramatically as guards were reassigned to protect the main house and search for the missing Ezra. The remaining overseers, demoralized by the deaths of their colleagues and fearful for their own safety, struggled to maintain discipline among an enslaved population that was increasingly convinced that supernatural forces were at work. As August drew to a close, it became clear that Whitmore Plantation was facing complete system failure. The death toll had risen to over 30 people, including key personnel whose expertise was essential for plantation operations. The surviving enslaved population was traumatized and unproductive, while the white family and remaining staff lived in constant fear of becoming the next victims. Dr. Morse's private correspondence during this period revealed his growing conviction that the situation had moved beyond any conventional medical or law enforcement response. Writing to a colleague, he described Whitmore Plantation as a community under siege by an enemy who possesses not only intimate knowledge of our vulnerabilities, but also a level of patience and strategic thinking that defies everything we thought we knew about the capabilities of enslaved people. The doctor's most chilling observation concerned the psychological sophistication of the campaign. Rather than simply killing as many people as possible, Ezra appeared to be deliberately orchestrating the plantation's collapse by targeting specific individuals whose deaths would create maximum disruption. The overseers and house slaves had been eliminated to destroy the information network, while the attacks on the Whitmore family were designed to demonstrate that even the most protected members of the plantation hierarchy were vulnerable. This calculated approach suggested that Ezra's ultimate goal was not simply revenge, but something far more ambitious: the complete destruction of the plantation system itself, achieved through methods that would expose its fundamental weaknesses and prove that no amount of control, could guarantee security against a sufficiently determined and intelligent opponent. September 1835 brought the climactic phase of what historians would later recognize as one of the most sophisticated acts of resistance in the history of American slavery. As the plantation teetered on the edge of complete collapse, Ezra emerged from hiding to deliver his final, devastating blow against the system that had enslaved him. The turning point came when Mrs. Whitmore succumbed to her illness after 2 weeks of agony, her death serving as the signal for what appeared to be a coordinated uprising among the enslaved population. But this was no conventional rebellion with armed conflict and violent confrontation. Instead, it was a systematic dismantling of every aspect of plantation operations, carried out with the precision of a military campaign and the intimate knowledge that only someone who had studied the system for years could possess. Fields that had been carefully tended for months were suddenly found sabotaged, with cotton plants cut at the roots and irrigation systems deliberately damaged. Storage facilities were broken into, with valuable supplies either destroyed or contaminated beyond use. Most critically, the plantation's financial records, the detailed ledgers that tracked everything from slave purchases to cotton sales, were discovered to have been systematically altered over a period of months, with false entries and missing pages that made it impossible to determine the true state of the operation. Colonel Whitmore, now isolated in his mansion with only a handful of loyal guards, found himself facing complete financial ruin. The plantation that had been his family's pride and the source of their considerable wealth was not only non-operational, but deeply in debt according to the altered records. Creditors who had been paid months earlier were now demanding payment for obligations that appeared to be outstanding, while banks were calling in loans that the records suggested had never been serviced. The sophistication of this financial sabotage revealed yet another dimension of Ezra's capabilities. Somehow he had not only learned to read and write, but had mastered the complex bookkeeping systems that governed plantation operations. His alterations to the financial records were so skillfully done that they initially appeared authentic, creating a web of false debts and obligations that would take months to unravel, if they could be unraveled at all. Dr. Morse, still attending to the growing number of victims, began to understand that he was witnessing something unprecedented in the annals of American slavery. His private notes from this period described Ezra as a mind of extraordinary calculation and patience, possessed of knowledge that defies everything we believed possible for someone in his position. The doctor's growing respect for his adversary was mixed with terror at the implications of what he was observing. If this story has already captured you, leave a like. It helps the story of Ezra reach more people. The final wave of poisonings began in early September, targeting the remaining white families and overseers with a precision that suggested Ezra had been planning these specific attacks for years. But unlike the earlier deaths, which had been carefully disguised to appear as natural illnesses, these final poisonings were clearly deliberate and designed to send a message. Victims were found with symptoms that could not be mistaken for disease, and in several cases evidence was left behind that made it clear the deaths were intentional. The most chilling discovery came when investigators found a hidden room beneath the plantation's main house, apparently constructed over a period of months through careful excavation during Ezra's maintenance work. This underground chamber contained an extensive collection of plants, minerals, and chemical substances that had been systematically gathered and processed into various poisons. Detailed notes, written in careful script, documented the effects of different substances, optimal dosages, and methods of administration. But the room contained more than just poison-making materials. Investigators found extensive documentation of plantation operations, including detailed maps of the property, schedules of personnel movements, and what appeared to be psychological profiles of key individuals. Most disturbing were the personal items that had been collected from various victims: locks of hair, pieces of clothing, and small personal effects that suggested Ezra had been studying his targets intimately for years. The discovery of this chamber finally provided authorities with concrete evidence of the scope and sophistication of Ezra's campaign, but it also raised troubling questions about how such extensive preparations could have gone undetected for so long. The chamber was accessed through the plantation's root cellar, a space that was used regularly for food storage, but which no one had thought to examine carefully. Its existence suggested that Ezra possessed not only chemical knowledge, but also engineering and construction skills that allowed him to create sophisticated hiding places while maintaining his cover as a simple laborer. As September progressed, the plantation's collapse accelerated. The remaining enslaved population, emboldened by the obvious success of Ezra's campaign and terrified by the continuing deaths among the white population, began to openly refuse work assignments. Some attempted to escape, while others simply abandoned their assigned tasks and gathered in groups to discuss the unprecedented events unfolding around them. Local authorities, finally recognizing the severity of the situation, called in military support from Mobile and Montgomery. But the soldiers who arrived found themselves facing not a conventional slave rebellion, but something far more complex and threatening. The plantation's infrastructure was systematically failing. Its financial systems were in chaos, and its workforce was in open revolt. Yet there was no clear enemy to fight, and no obvious way to restore order. The end came suddenly and completely. On September 15, 1835, Colonel Whitmore was found dead in his study, apparently having succumbed to the same type of poisoning that had claimed so many others. His death marked the effective end of Whitmore Plantation as an operational entity. Within days, creditors had moved to seize the property. Enslaved people had fled or been sold to satisfy debts, and the grand mansion that had once symbolized the pinnacle of plantation success stood empty and abandoned. Ezra himself was never found. Despite extensive searches that continued for months after the plantation's collapse, he seemed to have vanished as completely as he had appeared 3 years earlier. Some believed he had died during the final phases of his campaign, possibly succumbing to his own poisons, or killed in the chaos of the plantation's collapse. Others speculated that he had successfully escaped to the north, or perhaps to one of the communities of free people of color that existed in various parts of the South. But the mystery of Ezra's fate was overshadowed by the larger implications of what he had accomplished. In the space of less than 4 months, a single enslaved person had managed to completely destroy one of Alabama's most successful plantations, expose the vulnerabilities of the entire system of human bondage, and demonstrate that even the most carefully controlled operations could be brought down by someone with sufficient knowledge, patience, and determination. The destruction of Whitmore Plantation sent shockwaves throughout the plantation community of Alabama and beyond. News of the poisonings, the financial sabotage, and the complete operational collapse of one of the region's most successful plantations threatened to undermine the entire economic and social foundation of the antebellum South. But rather than acknowledge the reality of what had occurred, a conspiracy of silence began to form among the planter elite, designed to bury the truth so completely that future generations would never learn what Ezra had accomplished. The cover-up began within days of Colonel Whitmore's death, orchestrated by a group of prominent planters, local politicians, and business leaders who recognized that the truth about Whitmore Plantation posed an existential threat to their way of life. If enslaved people throughout the region learned that a single individual had managed to destroy an entire plantation through intelligence and planning rather than brute force, it could inspire similar acts of resistance that might bring down the entire system of human bondage. Judge Samuel Crawford, who had overseen many of the legal proceedings related to plantation operations in the region, took the lead in coordinating the cover-up. His private correspondence, discovered in family papers nearly a century later, revealed the scope and sophistication of the effort to erase Ezra's story from history. The judge understood that simply suppressing news of the events would not be sufficient. The story needed to be actively rewritten to eliminate any suggestion that enslaved people were capable of such sophisticated resistance. The first step was to alter the official records. Death certificates were rewritten to attribute the poisoning victims to various natural causes: fever, heart failure, consumption, and other common illnesses that would not arouse suspicion. The detailed medical notes that Dr. Morse had compiled were seized and destroyed, while the doctor himself was pressured to sign statements confirming that the deaths had resulted from disease rather than deliberate poisoning. Financial records presented a more complex challenge, since the alterations that Ezra had made created legal complications that could not simply be wished away. The solution was to claim that the plantation's books had been destroyed in a fire that had supposedly occurred during the final days of the crisis. New records were created from memory and surviving documents, eliminating any trace of the systematic sabotage that had contributed to the plantation's collapse. The physical evidence of Ezra's activities, including his underground chamber and its contents, was methodically destroyed. The room was filled with concrete and sealed, while the poison-making materials and documentation were burned. Even the main house itself was eventually demolished, with the official explanation being that it had become structurally unsound due to poor maintenance during the plantation's final months. Perhaps most insidiously, the cover-up extended to the enslaved people who had witnessed Ezra's campaign. Those who had been sold to satisfy debts were deliberately scattered to plantations throughout the Deep South, ensuring that they would have no opportunity to share their experiences with local communities. Others were required to sign statements, dictated by white authorities, claiming that they had no knowledge of any deliberate poisoning or sabotage at Whitmore Plantation. The few who refused to cooperate with this enforced amnesia faced severe consequences. Several were sold to plantations known for their harsh conditions, while others simply disappeared from all records. The message was clear. Anyone who attempted to preserve the truth about what had occurred would face retaliation not just against themselves, but against their families and communities as well. Local newspapers, which had initially reported on the mysterious deaths at Whitmore Plantation, were pressured to publish retractions and corrections that downplayed the significance of the events. Stories that had described suspicious circumstances and possible poisoning were replaced with bland accounts of disease outbreaks and business failures. Within months, even these sanitized accounts disappeared from regular coverage, as editors received clear signals that continued reporting on the subject would not be welcome. The church records presented another avenue that required careful management. Many of the victims had been buried in local cemeteries with funeral services that had attracted significant community attention. But the church registries that recorded these deaths were systematically altered to remove any suggestion that the deaths had been anything other than natural. Headstones were replaced with generic markers that provided no details about the circumstances of death, while funeral records were edited to eliminate references to suspicious symptoms or possible poisoning. The success of this cover-up was so complete that within a decade, most local residents had forgotten the specific details of what had occurred at Whitmore Plantation. The property itself was sold and subdivided, with new owners who had no connection to its previous history. The name Whitmore gradually disappeared from local records and memory, while references to Ezra became so rare that even the few surviving documents that mentioned him provided no clear indication of who he had been or what he had accomplished. But the cover-up went beyond simply erasing records and intimidating witnesses. The planters involved in the conspiracy understood that they needed to actively promote alternative narratives that would explain the plantation's collapse without acknowledging the possibility of sophisticated slave resistance. These alternative stories emphasized external factors, market fluctuations, disease outbreaks, and management failures that could account for the plantation's problems without suggesting that enslaved people were capable of organized and intelligent opposition. Over time, these fabricated narratives became accepted as historical fact. Academic histories of antebellum Alabama made no mention of Ezra or the poisoning campaign at Whitmore Plantation. Instead, they described the plantation's collapse as a typical example of the economic instability that affected many agricultural operations during the 1830s. The sophisticated intelligence and planning that Ezra had demonstrated were simply erased from the historical record, replaced by conventional accounts of slave resistance that focused on violent uprisings and escape attempts rather than strategic sabotage. The psychological impact of this cover-up extended far beyond the immediate participants. By erasing Ezra's story, the planter elite had not only protected their own interest but had also robbed future generations of enslaved people of knowledge about what was possible. The story of a single individual who had brought down an entire plantation through intelligence and patience might have inspired others to develop similar strategies of resistance, potentially undermining the entire system of human bondage. Instead, the official history of slavery continued to emphasize the supposed docility and limited capabilities of enslaved people, reinforcing the very stereotypes that the plantation system used to justify its existence. Ezra's demonstration that enslaved people could possess sophisticated knowledge, strategic thinking, and the patience to execute complex long-term plans was buried so thoroughly that it would take nearly 2 centuries for historians to begin uncovering the truth. The conspiracy to erase Ezra's story succeeded beyond its architect's wildest expectations. For more than 150 years, the events at Whitmore Plantation remained buried beneath layers of false documentation, intimidated silence, and deliberately fabricated alternative narratives. But the very completeness of this cover-up created a different kind of evidence. a silence so profound and systematic that it ultimately became suspicious to careful investigators. Dr. E.O. Sarah Collins's discovery of the courthouse documents in 2025 marked the beginning of a painstaking process to reconstruct what had been deliberately destroyed. Working with forensic historians, genealogists, and archaeologists, she began to piece together fragments of the truth from the spaces between the lies, the inconsistencies in official records, and the traces of memory that had survived despite all efforts to eliminate them. The first breakthrough came from an unexpected source: insurance records that had been stored in a different courthouse and had escaped the systematic destruction of Whitmore-related documents. The plantation had carried extensive insurance coverage on its buildings, equipment, and enslaved people, and the insurance company's records provided a detailed snapshot of the operation just months before its collapse. These records revealed discrepancies between the official accounts of the plantation's demise and the actual losses that had been reported to insurers. Most significantly, the insurance records documented the deaths of specific enslaved people who had been valued as particularly skilled or valuable workers. The timing of these deaths, cross-referenced with the fragmented courthouse documents, revealed a pattern that was inconsistent with natural disease, but perfectly aligned with a systematic campaign of targeted elimination. The insurance company's own investigation, conducted to determine whether claims should be paid, had identified suspicious circumstances that suggested deliberate sabotage. Archaeological evidence provided additional confirmation of the cover-up's scope. When Dr. Collins obtained permission to conduct limited excavations at the former plantation site, her team discovered evidence of the underground chamber that had been filled with concrete in the 1830s. Ground-penetrating radar revealed the outline of a sophisticated hiding place that was far more complex than anything that should have existed beneath a simple plantation house.